Yep.
Great. It's going to take us to the water before we start.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Oscar. I would like my POIs in chat. Don't unmute, please. Starting in 3, 2, 1. 2 notes at the beginning of this speech. The first is that it is deeply, deeply unprecedented to say that questions of justice should be decided by the democratic mass, who may not be informed, who don't need to follow due process, and who can be captured by corporate lobbies. We think that's a profound perversion of justice that opening government don't even seem to countenance. But secondly, we would say that if individuals and a majority of society truly thinks that a certain political crime shouldn't be punished, for instance, people protesting in government spaces for good causes, there is presently the power within democratic states through the legislature to make those political crimes no longer crimes. The burden on the government bench in this debate is different, which is to defend snap referenda for all political crimes, not just ones that are, are cherry-picked examples for the gov bench, and deciding justice in individual cases rather than on the goodness or badness of something being a political crime in the first place at that level. That's what opening opposition will give to you in this debate, and that's why we will win. Just a brief note of framing before I get into my two arguments. I think political framing is substantially more broad than it is represented in the info slide, and we would just characterize it, like opening government, as anything that is a crime against the political system. So things like court corruption, things like pork barreling, things like, for instance, refusing to step down after your term limits have elapsed. Those kinds of things are also political crimes. All right, then, what are our two arguments in this debate? The first, and a win condition in and of itself, is to establish that this is principally bad to determine questions of justice on public referenda. But secondly, that these referenda will likely to be corrupted by majority groups in a way that is pernicious for democracy and for the fate of minority groups in certain democracies. Let's start though with the principle, and the frame to place on this at the outset of the argument. Sorry, 4 debates in one day, is that this is a de facto legal process. It's making a determination of guilt or innocence because it's determining whether or not that person will suffer consequences for their action. So we think that it's relevant to determine whether or not a public referenda can actually make legitimate determinations of justice. We would say in 4 respects, it cannot. And we'll explain this by referencing things that justice should be and how public referenda do not meet that criteria. The first thing we will say is that justice should be fair. And we would say this is profoundly not so. In referenda, you can, for instance, have lots of spending by lobbies to change people's short-term opinion on individual cases. You can have ethnic majorities who have majority rule over a country that mean that cases are determined simply on the basis of race or identity. We think that's not fair. Secondly, we think that justice should be well considered and not random. And we would say that this is profoundly not the case in this instance. We think people's voting will not be informed. And this explains exactly why referenda are disanalogous to something like a jury, which opening government wants to talk about, because juries are definitionally well informed. They have to sit in the courtroom and listen to all the facts, and they have to be accountable to the law when they make a decision. In a referenda, you do not have to obey by any of those rules, and we think that is shit. But also, we would say that justice should follow due process, that people who make determinations about your innocence or guilt should have to hear your argument out. There's no guarantee in referenda that someone will be forced to listen to your opinion. They can just have a take and vote against you and not pardon you. Fourthly, we think information will often not be available to people because information is concealed in the instance of political crimes quite often because it's a threat to national security, which means people will be making actively bad decisions. For instance, they're likely to repeal things because they don't know things about that crime. Weigh this in this debate. Justice ought be fair. It ought be not random. It ought be well considered. It ought follow due process. And the reason you won't care about this at all in the debate is because the justice system has the great potential to institute harm against people. It restricts people's freedoms. It often can mean that they are subject to violence within the prison system. And if it is not just, then that is a fundamental perversion of that system, and we think that's not fair. But we'll also explain why these are practically co-opted by majority groups in a really pernicious way. The first thing to establish here is why political crimes are generally considered to be bad. And we have two reasons here. The first is very basically that they quite often put people's lives at risk. Think compromising the positions of civilians and soldiers in military conflicts that amount to essentially murder because those people get killed. I'll take a CG in a moment. But secondly, they often compromise the stability of state infrastructure. So it's things like breaking your term limits, being fundamentally corrupt when you run the government, causing constitutional crises. If you are able to get pardons for these kinds of crimes, it does lead to democratic backslides because there is no consequences for committing those actions. I'll take CG before I move on.
We allow the election of politicians to create coercive laws and utilize tax money forcibly taken from people. Why is the potential impact of people's choices a reason to restrict it in this case, but not in the elections?
Yeah, it's because when you make laws in general, that's what it reflects society's preferences. So for instance, if you make a law that's like, oh, this particular political crime should be a crime, then that reflects society's preferences, right? But individual justice has vastly different criteria. Like whether or not someone's guilty of a crime is not something that can be controlled by a democracy. Like they're obviously different burdens that are disanalogous. All right, who now can win with referenda? We think firstly it's majority ethnic groups. For instance, in states with power sharing agreements between those ethnic groups, those power sharing agreements can be ignored, and that political agreement can be, through that referenda, pardoned, meaning that those power sharing agreements get broken. But secondly, you would think it's people who ride the waves of populist political movements. For instance, the people who rode the riot, did the Capitol riots in the United States. These people would be able to be pardoned for their political crimes because they ride the force of popular movements. Thirdly, it's probably corporate lobbies, really rich people who do commit political crimes like lobbying politicians who are able to buy lobbies that change people's preferences in referenda, that perhaps even like in states like Indonesia are able to bribe them. The impact of this is democratic backslides if people are empowered politically, or they're rich, or they're a part of an ethnic minority. And it's often the reversion and perversion of accountability structures that keep democracies stable. This is principally wrong to determine questions of justice by democracy, and it's practically wrong in the ways that it compromises democracy. Really proud to stand in OO.
All right, I thank the leader of opposition for that speech. Now let me invite the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
POI is in the chat. I will probably take closing at some point. So let me know if you've got one. 3, 2, 1. Opening government is more or less out of this debate for the reason that first, they failed to engage with whether or not this is principally fair. And second, it's deeply unclear to me what their positive set of impacts are beyond a nebulous principle that you have a right to be enfranchised, when clearly the application of laws is not an instance where we allow people to be enfranchised. I'm first going to weigh Oscar's material, then I'm going to briefly delete opening government, then I'm going to bring some more material to weigh against closing. All right, let's start with what Oscar brings you. The first thing Oscar brings you is to say that, well, you now are going to have instances in which the majority can tear down the state, can commit crimes against the state in order to entrench their own power and never be accountable for that because they have the majority support. That looks like big businesses who can bribe voters. That looks like majority ethnic groups. That looks like a big populist movements, for instance, the movements that surrounded Donald Trump's election. And this is the biggest practical harm in the debate, right? Because it means that the majority, the politically powerful, can destroy the mechanisms of the state to their own enjoyment and to their own power, and fuck over any minority groups within that country, often destroy democracy itself. These protections are incredibly important for protecting the democratic processes that opening government stands behind in the first instance. Their failure to respond to that is the end of them already. Second reason opening government is going to lose, and this is the biggest contribution to debate, is that we explained it is principally unfair to prosecute people on these grounds. We first explained that they're simply likely to not have the requisite information. The response from Deputy Prime Minister is, yes, but at the point at which they care a lot, they will learn. Perhaps, but your burden is to prove that individuals will care a lot. Most individuals have other things going on in their lives. They have families, they have jobs. They're not going to take the time to massively educate themselves about every referendum. The second thing we tell you is that you often simply cannot release the requisite information for people to make this decision. For instance, if someone has committed espionage, you cannot release the sets of information that tell us about why this espionage was bad, because they are state secrets that you cannot reveal. People definitionally cannot have those sets of information. But even if you don't buy either of those two reasons, we give you 3 reasons this is principally fucked that receive absolutely zero engagement. First, we explain that justice fundamentally ought to be equal, and the fact that these referendums can be bought, the fact that these referendums favor those in the majority is wrong. Second, we explain that there is no due process. There is no guarantee of a right for your argument to be heard, for you to be treated fairly. So wrong. And third, we explain that there's a high degree of randomness in the way in which this is done. We explain that you are likely to get changing conditions from referendum to referendum, and it's deeply, deeply wrong that we put out justice based on the random changes in society. This is the most important contribution to the debate, and it's the reason that opening opposition is going to take the first, because justice must first and foremost be fair. We could, for instance, lock up large swaths of the population that are disproportionately likely to commit crimes because it would get us some benefit, but we do not, for the reason that we say justice must be apportioned fairly, that we ought not lock people up, we ought not make these decisions in an unfair and arbitrary way. That is why opening government and every other team in this debate loses it, because it is wrong to prosecute people in this way. Let's quickly look at opening government's case. Their case is essentially to say, oh, but there's likely to be minority groups that are disproportionately out of, for instance, the levers of government. The problem is that their side stands for straight majoritarianism, right? Just directly, the majority makes the decision. We think that on our side, there are a number of layers of abstraction, which makes it harder for the majority to implement their will on the minority, none of which get engaged with by opening government. First, things like constitutions, which mandate equal treatment under the laws that legislatures can pass. Second, things like power sharing agreements under which politicians operate, which means that they cannot just exert their influence. Third, courts, which mandate the equal treatment of individuals. And fourth, politicians who are often not directly majoritarian for the reason that they care about the long-term stability of their state. It was baffling that they wanted to talk about majoritarianism and how wrong that was at the point where they were directly standing for majoritarianism. They then say, well, judicial courts are likely to be majoritarian, but we think judiciaries in general enforce the laws in the way in which they are written. First, I'd point out that this is empirically true. Second, I'd point out that they are trained to do that, and that their legal training says to implement the laws in the way that they are written. And third, I'd point out that they want to maintain the legitimacy of courts. They also say that democracy is bad, but the difference is that democracies have to pass laws which apply equally to everyone. Their side of the debate is the one that is applying laws unequally, that is fundamentally wrong. Their next claim is that you have a right to be enfranchised, right? Maybe you have a right to be enfranchised in the way that the law is written, but you do not have a right to be individually enfranchised in every decision, because that means that decisions are likely to be majoritarian, because it does not protect the interests of the minority. And secondly, we would say that the principle of equality under the law is much more important than majoritarianism. I also just think this right to be enfranchised is ridiculous. Like, we clearly recognize that it's not a principled harm that not every individual is able to vote on every instance. I'll take closing.
Yeah, so who are the people that are creating the laws that the people are prosecuted under?
Sorry, can you say that again?
So who are the people creating laws that these criminals are prosecuted under?
Yeah, so I just answered this question before, and I explained why they are significantly less majoritarian. I gave you 4 mechanisms for why they are significantly less majoritarian than the just the direct majoritarianness of a referendum is what I'm looking for. Their final claim is just to say, well, this is going to be disproportionately vulnerable people. First, the fact that you are a vulnerable individual does not mean it is all right that you committed a heinous crime against the state. Second, the vulnerable people are usually the ones from the minority in that country, who therefore are not going to be helped by the referendum. And third, I'd note it's now much easier to crack down on the minority, for the reason that you can now pass more stringent laws to, for instance, stop them protesting, while knowing that that law will not apply to you, for the reason that you can get your group out of being prosecuted from that law through a large referendum. So on the metric of majority people, we clearly weird. Opening government is out of this debate. What I'm going to do now is to provide some more content to weigh against what I think will come from closing government. So first of all, why are these referendums in and of themselves bad? That is firstly because they lead to an enormous amount of information being revealed, right? For instance, if someone has done espionage, you do not want to draw attention to those state secrets and have them come out more. And second, often those referendums are themselves the site of, for instance, violence between different ethnic groups. Closing government might claim, but there's going to be a range of good people who do good things, like, for instance, reveal state secrets. First, in the majority of instances, it will not be the less powerful against the powerful, simply for the reason that the people who have the most capacity to commit these forms of crimes are the powerful. It is far more likely, if you are a member of the president's office, that you have the power to commit a crime against democracy than someone lower down was. And second, I know in the really good instances that they might want to talk about, for instance, the instances in which we have whistleblowers, I note that these individuals are generally not prosecuted for the reason that first, it is politically unpopular, and for the reason that second, they don't want to draw attention to the whistleblower and the information that they revealed, such to stop the information coming out. At the end of opening half, we proved it is just wrong to prosecute people in an arbitrary and fucked up way. That is the thing that is going to take opening opposition the first. But even on the practical question, we are the ones who prove that you do not get democratic backslide. Biggest practical impact.
All right, I thank the DLO for that speech. Now I invite the member of Gov. Here.
All right. Gonna assume audio is working fine. TJ, no preference for pronouns. Put POIs in the chat. Would love to engage opening. Past 5.
Sorry, your audio is a bit muffled.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Is the audio better now?
Yeah, it's a bit better now. Thank you.
Seems like it.
Okay, I think I just need to speak louder. I should get better as my speech progresses. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Closing Gov is going to be opening government on the basis of having stronger responses that, number one, wins the comparative against opening opposition, but number two, provides the principled weighing as to why the rights of the public, the right to access this information, trumps the right to justice in the absolute best case of opening opposition. I think this is the weighing mechanism that the OG hints at but never explicitly proves. First point of extension. I think we need to reframe how and when this referenda is called, because it is unfair for the opening opposition to say that referendums are going to be called in each and every single instance where a crime against the state has occurred. The motion says allow these things to happen, which means in cases where it is controversial, it allows for people to demand a referendum. I think this is most likely to apply to highest level cases, right? Cases like Edward Snowden and the NSA spying scandal, cases like WikiLeaks and Julian Assange leaking all this kind of sensitive information that expose politicians for the corruption and the scandals and the things that they were operating in. This means that this is not going to be happening in each and every single circumstance, and I think it's unfair for opening opposition to expect us to defend that. Even if that's the case, I still think principally we are right. The second thing to note is that the argument on due process is not part of the debate for the reason that this is referendum to determine a pardon, which means the judiciary has already found these people guilty, have already given them the due process, the investigation, the consideration of evidence and all those things. The question in this debate is whether a referendum should pardon people found guilty because of the way that laws were constructed fundamentally. This implies firstly that due process has already been provided, assuming the best case where the judiciary is separated from the executive. But second, in the cases where judiciary finds them innocent, there's like no evidence, for example, or the judiciary finds that this person is just not guilty of this crime. I just think that these people are by and large not going to be a part of this debate. The third thing we'll say is that we do not think the judiciary is separate from the executive in most Western liberal democracies, for the reason that this is a specific conflict of interest when the state determines what is a crime unto itself. We think that people who are making these laws are the politicians, right? Politicians who have massive incentive to prioritize themselves over their electorate. Like the president in the United States, the executive have massive incentive to prioritize themselves, their power, which is why they always try to do things via things like executive order, by the appointing of Supreme Court justices to expand their political ideology, especially in a polarized, in an ideologically polarized political system such as the US, which means that there will be no power sharing agreements in Western liberal democracies outside of maybe coalition, which doesn't change the fact that abuse still happens. But second, most places, right, the head of the executive appoints the Supreme Court justices, which means the separation of power in those cases is not necessarily clear, which is why in the US, Supreme Court justices are so polarized by ideology, which means you can predict the outcome of controversial social issues by the number of conservative and liberal justices on the bench. We think that there are clear political incentives for people who are part of the institution to preserve the institution because they directly benefit from it, even if it comes at the cost of hurting the people or the people that they were duty bound and sworn to protect. The absolute best case of opening opposition assumes it's not the case. I think it's most certainly the case that there is a conflict of interest. But even if that's not the case, right? OO says that the judiciary is not always says that the judiciary is better because we have judges and juries and things like that. Number one, juries are limited in number. Judges are subject to political incentives and cannot account for the wishes of everyone. If on a comparative, we think that they are clear, or like on a comparative, it is far better that matters of public interest ought to be decided by the public, especially when those elected representatives and the people in the judiciary have clear conflict of interest to prioritize themselves at the expense of those people out there. I think that the public has the greatest say, we're most proximate towards their direct interest. In cases where it is controversial, where you cannot get a clear mandate, you ought default to direct democracy and deriving the will of the people. The next thing that opening up says, now everyone's going to be pardoned, right? Like this is just going to be abused. Like this makes no sense. The best example here is things like Capitol Hill riots, corporate lobbies, etc. And I'm not sure why this is the case. It is unclear why the examples they refer to are crimes against the state in the first place, because the Capitol Hill riots are disruption of public order as well as vandalism. These are not crimes against the state per se. The second is that even in the case where those things were considered crimes against the state, I'm not sure why the public would be necessarily be willing to buy into the kind of information campaign that asserts was going to be so effective and then pardon these people. Because the only example we have here is things like Trump supporters, right? Trump didn't win the popular vote, by the way. His supporters are very loud, but ultimately a minority of people in America, which means that by and large, most people prioritize justice and equality. Most people prioritize their self-interest, and they don't want states doing horrible things, which is why in most cases, when it comes down to matters of public interest, we're significantly more likely to vote in favor of greater public interest as opposed to these niche people that are going to hurt democracy, which means that which also responds to backsliding not really being likely to happen in this specific debate. I think the more likely context we're talking about is in cases like Edward Snowden exposing the NSA spying scandal, or the WikiLeaks and the Julian Assange cases that you are actively leaking state secrets, because that's a clear example of leaking classified documentation and a clear example of sedition in that case. OG's response to this, reflecting majority racist things bad, to say that it's symmetric. We said that the cases most pertinent to the public interest, like the cases I talked about, transcends racial lines, which means that it does not matter whether you are white or black in America. You care that your state not torture terrorists. You care that your state not spy on you, which is why we think that this mechanism trumps this majority, this racial tension thing that the opening opposition want to talk about. But the second thing we'll say, and here's where I do the direct weighing, right, as to why democracies require, or why the prioritization of information is better. We think that people care about themselves first and foremost, which means if the state is doing horrible things, most people will care about it, which means you're more likely to get justice, more likely to get a pardon for Edward Snowden outside than you are in the opposition. The second reason, in principle, democracy ought to prioritize the majority of people. Majoritarianism is really good because most people tend towards justice and equity. Most people care that states don't torture innocent immigrants. Most people care that states don't interrogate and spy on them, which is the reason why majoritarianism is a good thing, and it's unclear why that's bad as what OO suggested to be. But the last thing, that democracy ought allow for the accountability of the most powerful people and ought to have support mechanisms to hold them in check, especially in cases where this mechanism has failed. I think we need an alternative. Opening up, go for it.
Yeah, so I already preempted your extension and explained why on the way up, these cases are likely to be the minority because there's incentives not to prosecute and because they're the most politically powerful who have the most ability to commit crimes against the state. See dictators staying in power too long.
So dictators staying in power, the context we're debating in has to be a liberal democracy where there's a functioning judiciary in your world, which means that dictators is not part of the debate for the reason that there is no democracy, there is no democratic checks and balances. So that POI really does not make sense. The last thing I just want to do it from opening up, this small thing about information cannot be released, therefore people can never make a informed decision. We reject this outright. Snowden leaked classified material, which was necessary for people to know what the state was doing about it. Even if that's not the case, there are plenty of evidence that can be made public and people can decide on that specific basis. So I don't think the lack of information is a problem. The last thing I'll add about information here is specifically why we have to release this information in this specific regard. It is because this information that is required to prove the culpability of those leaders in power. It is people to prove that George W. Bush knew that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, that he wanted to invade on the basis of economic incentives and go there to get oil. This is required for you to have that information to directly hold your leaders accountable. A world where these things do not exist because you disincentivize people from coming out and holding the state accountable is a worse off world for everyone. We're so proud to propose.
All right, I thank the member of GOV for that speech. Now to invite the member of OP here.
Hi, am I audible and visible? Just checking.
Yep.
Okay, cool. I'll take a POI around 5+ minutes. I'll queue opening, if possible, prepare a POI. If not, I'll take closing. starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, a national referendum is designed to maximize utility, hinging on the principle of democracy. Insofar as the processes of the national referendum are not principally democratic, Gov cannot claim any utility, and that's why we'll win. What I'm going to do, 3 things. First, we talk about why we weigh over OO because they've missed a blatant part of this debate. Second, I'll go into my rebuttals about OG and CG, and finally, I'll bring you 2 brand new characterizations and substantives in this debate, right? Let's talk about OO first. OO says mainly their whole principle is they shouldn't be able to vote because they are not impartial, right? OO recognizes the harms of national referendum, but by making it analogous to democracy, their case is is unintuitive as a whole, right? Because like things like people not caring, ethnic minorities, and like random variables are not things that are unique to a national referendum. They are the same for democracy, right? So by going against that, they're actively like going against democracy, and we are the opposition side that will show you why these things are different. CO recognizes that being biased is fine in democracy. Not caring is also a valid stance in a democracy. We weigh above OO when the people who want to care about the votes, who want to think critically about their decisions, are not able to simply because political crimes were committed against them. They don't have the agency to think fully, and that's why they cannot fully vote, and that's why the national referendum is not democratic. We beat OO because we uniquely recognize how valid and critical decisions cannot be made because of 3 reasons. First, the political crimes affected them directly. Second, you remove the ability and agency of state to provide you with information. And third, this makes you either a compliant or a victim of the political crime, which means you have a vested interest. The same way we don't allow victims of the crime to be in a jury, we don't allow these people to vote for a national referendum that is not democratic in its principle, right? Moving to my rebuttals. First, let's talk about OG when they say, but presidential pardons happen on your side. Where's the leap? What this leap in logic doesn't make sense, because if you did a crime against the president, why would the president then want to pardon you? We tell you less pardons happen on our side, right? But second, they want to talk about how more discourse and conversations will happen, and the rebuttals to this is integrated into my speech. Next, let's talk about how CG, first of all, concedes that political polarization is harmful. Therefore, I'll show you in my speech that political polarization is worse for them, and that's why we win over CG as well. Moving into my substantives. First, let's talk about why the national referendum fails in the case of political crime to exercise democracy. Why do we allow the national referendum, right? We tell you it's to maximize utility. We do it on the assumption of 2 assumptions. First, that people are aware of what happened, and second, they are aware of what the outcomes of their votes will be. We don't allow victims of a crime to be in the jury. Why? Because only when they understand the event and the outcome, when they make the best choices for themselves, they have to be in a spot where they weren't harmed at all. They have to be in a spot where they can act in a vacuum and objectively see what's happening. They might be impartial to their own values, but as long as they're not impacted, that's when we think that that's the only time that they can make an active choice, which is democracy. But this is not democracy because they're directly affected by the crime, right? Whether you are the political criminal or the victim, we tell you that a huge part of this debate falls into these 2 categories. Are you the victim, or are you the person compliant in making the political crime happen? Simply because the nation is bipartisan, right? Either because one party is going to be in power, so the other party is the one going to be committing political crimes against them, right? So you have a vested interest inside the referendum, and you're blinded by your emotions because now the narrative becomes, no, the other side is committing political crimes to take away our rights. Our president is now facing a danger to themselves because these political crimes are being committed. Therefore, there's no such thing as more conversation that happens. Instead, 2 birds, 1 stone moment right here. You get more political polarization on your side because political crimes are committed, and now people will say, oh, let's vote. And they're not going to vote critically. They're going to vote that people are taking away my rights, and I am now going to have emotions into this. I've been wronged, and therefore now I'm going to vote. This is not democracy. This is simply a way for people to cheat the system and get out of crimes against the government, right? So in this moment, we told you how political polarization is more likely to happen on their side, and why we don't get any discourse because people are so polarized. OG and CG have this clash that has to be sorted out. So what is our alternative, right? We rely on legislation made where legislators were agents within the realms of democracy. That is to say, they were free of being a victim. They might have their own interests, granted, but they weren't like a direct effect of the crime. So what should be made when their minds were clear should be state, instead of like letting other people make their decisions when they were affected by these crimes. Second, and this is exclusive to our side, because all OO talked about was the principle, why it's principally bad, but we told you how they missed that. But again, if you don't buy that, we're going to tell you about the dangerous precedent that's set. And this is the most valuable contribution on a practical scale that we think will come out of this debate as a whole, right? Let's give them their best. Maybe the political crimes were justified. Maybe everything that TJ wanted to bring up were justified and people had the right to vote so that they would get pardoned. But pardoning sets the dangerous precedent of political crimes becoming an option for everyone. The harms are twofold, right? First, more violence, right? Our world, people wouldn't even consider it as an option, but in their world, people commit political crimes in hopes of getting pardoned, right? In our world, Trump's Capitol riots happened and actions were taken. In their world, the precedent set will now be weaponized by Trump to make the riot even more violent and bloody, simply because now he can allow and tell people, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to get into power, and people are going to see that we are redeeming our power. This is justified. So protests become more violent and bloody. I'll take opening right now, if there's a PY. Any PI opening? No? Closing, sure.
If you accept polarization exists, then the harm could still manifest by legislators, presidents, and Supreme Court justices pushing their own agendas in your world. Uniquely, referenda transcends partisan issues if you don't have the ability to do so on your side because of the conflict of interest.
Correct. But we told you why these things are partisan to begin with. When someone else commits a political crime against the state you voted in, you feel like your rights are being snatched away. Maybe legislators and like Supreme Court justices have their own like rights. We're not saying they're impartial, but people are even less like partial on your side when an active crime has been committed against them in the heat of the moment due to proximity. We think the vested interest and the emotions people have to not think clearly is even worse on your side, right? Yeah, so on their world, people like sorry, where was I? The president said will be weaponized by people like Trump, right? The delta isn't those who riot on either side, is the people who were scared of going to prison will now see the light at the end of this dystopian tunnel to now justify the act of like going up. Last time they'd be scared of prison, but now when they see the chance of them getting pardoned, they're going to take this to become a more active step. This does two things. It makes crimes like this more frequent and more vicious, right? We tell you this also leads to delegitimization of the state. Where people feel like political crimes aren't as bad, they find that when they find the state has failed them more. When states don't cater to their wants, they blame the state for their failure. So what's the impact, right? There's less ability to enact democratically elected policies, and now there'll be like harsher policing towards these people because the people in power simply cannot feel like they are in power if people can just rise up and commit political crimes against them, and suddenly they just get off scot-free. This world simply must fall. So proud to oppose.
All right, I thank the member of OP for that speech. I can invite the government whip here.
All right, just a second. All right, am I audible and visible?
Yep.
All right, thank you. I'll take POIs verbally, preferably from opening for like short cross engagement, but if not, closing is meant to be fine. All right. All right, speech starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to structure this speech in this way. The first is I'll explain why the extension coming from TJ is existentially important in this debate, and what are responses we got from closing opposition, why they're just heavily inadequate. And second of all, I'll respond to closing opposition to Macho to directly delete them out of this debate. And third of all, talk about opening opposition. Last of all, weighing ourselves against opening up, and conclusively why TJ needs to tackle first. First, in terms of what is the extension coming from TJ, and what was the response coming from Theo? Literally, with the first extension that TJ tells you is a reframe of what this particular pardon or the action of this particular pardon actually looks like. We call it it's in fact unfair for the opening opposition to say that in each and every single one of the instances you allow the referendum to occur, which is just that in fact it's more likely or not to occur in higher level standards of critical cases to which it literally affects the public's ability to function. Things like that literally has capacity to affect the public's ability to function. The comparative in the opposition is not a world to which they reflect, but rather it's what TJ told you. That is the first think TJ tells you. The second is that we told you judiciaries already provide some level of guilt upon these individuals, which are already speculative individuals of being guilty. The debate therefore needs to be about, in the instance which these individuals to some extent are already found guilty, should we allow the referendum? Should we allow the public to be able to decide on a referendum or not? But I want to note the importance of this particular extension. The first is it directly undermines the principle of individual justice coming from opening opposition, because insofar as not in each and every single instance, or not in majority of instances, but only in the critical instances that a particular referendum is necessitated, it applies in the most important instances where in fact the public must be the principle. Literally that hinders the entirety of the principle, because therefore it's unclear why individual justice is particularly hindered on our side of the house. But we told you about the example of Edward Snowden of exposing that NSA spying scandal in this case. Second of all, we also talked about the example of WikiLeaks. So it directly undermines all your old principles. But second, this takes us both opening government, because understand it is in fact the failure of opening government to resolve the particular principle clash within the opening debate. Realize that if this principle clash is not resolved, the entirety of opening government and all the benefits are literally hindered as a result of this. It is only in TJ's speech that this is resolved where we question the inadequacies of the framing covered by opening oppositions. So the first part of extension does two things. First, it directly takes us above opening government because the framing in itself is a necessity for the arguments to fly. But second of all, understand this also better responds to opening opposition in this case, which also is also a second reason as why we need to take above opening government. So at this particular point, it's quite clear already. But second, let's talk about closing opposition there right here. The only argument it brought to you is that polarization is likely to exist and therefore it is bad because like literally we just prosecute people out of nowhere. But we question in TJ's POI that if you accept polarization, if you accept the existence of polarization, harms will still materialize, but things like legislators, presidents, and FPJs, they're pushing their own political agenda uniquely because the referendum transcends partisan issues that you don't have because of that on your side of the house. The response was, oh, we don't know why. The response was, oh, but this is partisan to begin with. That is inadequate, but it's unclear as to why Snowden leaking documents is partisan to begin with. Then literally everyone unanimously on a vote opposed it to begin with. That is why exactly the instances which it is part of this debate, it is not partisan as the response coming from the closing opposition were too. The burden on their side of the house then is to tell us in particular as to why it's okay for these things to materialize, specifically on their side of the house or not. It is entirely symmetric on both sides of the house. There's no comparative value to the side of closing opposition. We've totally taken them out in this debate, but clearly we don't want to pardon stupid people in this particular case. But a second extension that TJ brought you right here was also existentially important, which is about a principle way. That people care about themselves first and foremost, which about something that it infringes upon themselves, they're more likely or not to care about it. That is exactly on a principle level, we still take them up anyways. So we're done with closing opposition. Let's now move on to opening opposition, the thing that is immensely uncomparative. The first thing it tells us that it is likely to be corrupted by the majority group. But we told you, minorities can collectivize and unionize on both sides of the house, like things like elections in particular, where you can unionize together as a collective bloc to vote in a particular direction. We say this entirely and symmetrically applied in this instance anyway. It is unclear what a minority, because of this particular referendum, is likely to be sidelined to such a significant extent as per the description. The second thing they tell you is that it's a very big argument about how we can pass stringent laws that literally harm and perishes minorities. Literally, this is not part of this debate because the debate is about political crimes. We're not about passing laws. The state passes the law, so literally that still applies to both sides of the house. That is not applied in our model. That argument does not stand. But a logic pull coming from the opening opposition that I still want to clash with at this point is the principle about individual justice and fairness. So the factor is that they say that the public is majoritarian and therefore that is likely to be an apparatus and a weapon against the minorities. But we suggest that the judges are like, we told you a couple of things right here. First, TJ explains why the executives and the judiciaries in itself are internally conflicted and why they're just internally conflicted at this point. So the judiciaries are unlikely to be fair. But second, we suggest that if the public is white right here, we suggest that the judges are more likely or not to be whitelist in this particular case. It comes from the most privileged backgrounds, the most elitist positions that ultimately enable them to be where they are today. It is plausible for them to emerge as the best out of the best in order to sit at this particular position. So the amount of literally Literally, this is why exactly that's what the amount of conservative versus liberal judges, where if you look at the number of liberal and conservative judges within a particular court case, you can always predict the end goal of it. I think that is particularly as to why literally if the public is likely to be biased to some extent, the judges are or not symmetric, or actually worse. But a comparative to this on our side is that the moment to allow, if you put the power into the hands of the public, is that we do not allow the particular decisions or important decisions to be shackled upon the hands of a couple to be shackled upon and to be concentrated on a couple of incredibly immensely white judges on their side of the house. So if the public and both the judges are likely to be white anyways, we say that the judge is significantly worse. But even if you grant the opening opposition their malleability of the principle of this, we tell you that the accountability argument that TJ told you in this debate is significantly more important. They were able to hold individuals to a higher standard of accountability because there is a potential for information to be leaked. We think that extension uniquely takes us above them anyways. Lastly, in the weighing against opening government, realize we've already given you two different reasons and the top of my speech exactly is why we beat them already. First on why literally the principle frame first on why the framing on our side of how directly takes out opening opposition. So we better respond to opening opposition. We better beat opening opposition in this case. But second of all, it is on a principle level that we told you it's only in TJ's speech we're able to resolve the principle clash, but only the analysis I've just provided you now that directly triumphs and undermines opening opposition's principle at its best. That is only particularly why we allow opening government's impacts of the practicalities to fly. For these reasons, clearly with one.
All right, I thank the government whip for that speech. Now I can invite the op whip. Here.
Hello, can you see and hear me? Well, let me adjust the lighting.
Yep.
Just. POIs in the chat, preferably from opening. He, him. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. We as closing opposition are the only team to identify why these referendums are in fact undemocratic. Why is this important? It's because the principle underlying both government cases and somewhat of OO's case, which was really weird honestly, relies on this fact that it is somehow democratic, and because we preserve democracy, we should preserve this as well. The actual analysis as to why these two things are not analogous only comes in Jadon's speech. I don't know why the speaker before me tried to just pretend like that argument didn't exist and just respond to the other arguments. Because I think that the meta argumentation that Jadon gave you is clearly what wins us this debate. First, let me just talk on our extension. What did Jadon actually give you that he didn't respond to? He told you exactly why democracy doesn't apply. Because we need to understand what a political crime that was committed actually looks like. I think TJ does most of the framing that happened within this debate up to that point. Like opening house didn't do much, but this is something that I don't understand why, because it's in the info slide. People just seem to disregard it. Political crimes are things that harm state security, are things that harm political system, that is to say democracy, are things that harm the legitimacy and the belief toward the state. Because we understand that in a democratic institution, even though we allow people to simply not care, and we allow people to care if they want, we must make sure that people are able and have the capacity in order to actually act on, if they were to care, they must be able to make sure that they know all the facts, to understand how these things happen. In proper democracies, people are allowed to do that. Within these institutions where we are trying to get referendums on political crimes, these people aren't allowed to get a proper utilitarian calculus, which by their principle is supposed to help aggregate what people want. And the reason for this is their agency has been compromised insofar as they don't really feel whether or not the state they can really trust anymore, whether they can trust these people anymore, because their agency has been compromised in ways in which doesn't happen under regular democracy and regular politics. Why is this important strategically wise? It beats opening opposition because we're actually giving a principle other than just some rhetoric and just some reasons that are analogous to democracy. But we also beats both OG and CG's principle, which was like CG recognizes a bulk of OG's case and why OG is out as well. But on political polarization specifically, because OG argues that this is going to have some sort of good discourse that people are going to come and say, oh, what do you think about this issue? This issue is something that's really important. But understand then CG says, this is something that is highly controversial. That is why we're going to go have a referendum on it. Understand, every team says it's controversial. That means it's likely going to be something that is partisan. It is not like government whip say leaking docs is not partisan. Because if you're in any state in rural America, they believe that any leaking of government information or anything that goes against the government is in fact wrong, because they see the government as a father figure to them. This means that their argument that it's not partisan even empirically doesn't make sense, but structurally we're the only ones who told you why it's partisan. Why is this important? Because the point at which one group, like TJ wants to talk about America, let's say the Democrats say, oh, this is something that we should fight against. That always means that the Republican Party is going to feel like this is something that they should protect. This is something they should be against. That's when people are trying to polarize what has to be some political crime that has been committed. They're trying to try and polarize and get people to be on one side or the other on something that is a, much to say, civil rights issue. We feel that is something that is undemocratic and harmful in and of itself. So why is this strategically important also? Because I feel that CG is the one that gave like the most, out of the other three teams, the most good argumentation, but our whole argumentation was to mitigate political polarization. That's what they wanted to do. Insofar as their policy generates more political polarization, we show that they are in fact counterproductive. TJ's POI was like, oh, that means you recognize political polarization exists. Yeah, we do. But insofar as your whole aim is to reduce it and you increase it, we see that your whole argument just flips on its side. We talk about the perpetuation of the illegitimacy of the state, pardon my ESL. Like why the January 6th riot is related to this. Because the January 6th riot happened because people felt the state was illegitimate. They felt that Biden is an illegitimate leader of the state and not somebody that they wanted to support. This just goes to show the point at which people feel the state is legitimate. That is the point at which a lot of these harms are going to manifest. Harms that maybe TJ is trying to get to, but never really proved them to fruition. Why is this important in this debate? Because Jadon tells you that the point at which you keep undermining what it is that is a political crime, you keep saying that political crimes are things that are not so bad, maybe we can repeal them, those kinds of things, and pardon them, something that we are against entirely. That's the point at which these types of riots, these type of people who feel like they have some sort of duty to go over the state and overcome the state are going to be perpetuated. People are going to feel this is an ideology that is something that is reasonable. We feel that is something that harms the legitimacy of state in and of itself. Harming legitimacy of state, Jadon impacted that to mean that, oh, you know, like now the state can actually function properly insofar as people don't believe in it. But the point at which people don't believe in state institutions, they can actually work politically insofar as, you know, the state holds political institutions. What were the responses we heard from government whip? And I don't know why he didn't spend a lot of time on it when government whip should be spending a lot of time on CEO's extension. Are the crimes partial? TJ proves for me it's partial because he says it's a controversial issue. So your analysis just answered your own question. I don't see how CG can win this debate. On CG's substantive material, they say on the separation of judiciary and legislature. Understand again that all this seems to do is mitigate polarization insofar as TJ himself says that you can decide whether or not this thing is a crime or not based on how many people in the Supreme Court are Republican or Democrat, is a concession to the fact that this is a partisan issue. That means that you yourself, like, feeding into analysis that I said earlier that you try and rebut against anyway. But again, it's strategic because their whole case is to mitigate political polarization. I understand panel is some meta things, quite meta here. But insofar as we are able to say that they aren't doing that, they lose what they're trying to do in the debate. And they talk about when pardons happen. I think this is framing that deals with opening houses. I'll take OG now. CG.
Okay, so every opinion poll in the US has leaned in favor of Snowden, which means that the referendum was likely to pardon him. In our world, it is not a partisan issue, but he will not get justice in yours.
Yeah, the thing is, when you talk about US, you can't really say what's a partisan issue empirically because you all say that Roe v. Wade is something that's non-partisan, but huge amounts of people believe it to be like partisan, like huge amount of people support it. I don't think that's an empirical argument that's going to win you this debate. Insofar as America is so huge that things are likely partisan in the ways in which they look at the government. It's likely for people to believe that it is something that is partisan. That's likely why it's not overturned. Insofar as people in the Senate or whoever it is that is in this legislature thing are also humans, are also running through their own beliefs, meaning that, you know, that is their partisan belief. On OG's representation, they say it affects everyone. All of this is contingent on the practical, like Jadon told you. They talk about protecting minorities. It doesn't happen because it's a majoritarian that CG even concedes. Political participation and discussion, we showed you why this is likely going to be toxic insofar as it's a partisan discussion. And on accountability, people knowing the facts, we showed you why political crimes make people disillusioned with what exactly the fact is. Even in cases where they're giving people information, the fact that they're not giving people the whole piece of the pie, I mean the whole pie, just a piece of the pie, means that people aren't really aware of what the whole situation is. They don't understand why exactly the government this did a certain thing, leads to just conspiracy theories. We don't think that that is something that we are proud of. Opening opposition, all they did was unintuitively try and analogize this to democracy. I think CG beats them and we beat them in commutative property. Thank you.
All right, I think the opposition wait for their speech. That marks the end of this round, and this is a silent round again. So you may leave this call. I think that's all for today.